All right, before Jack introduces things, because I'm the one that messed up the technology. Sorry, this is not exactly where you expected it to be, but we're live, and every time this happens, we get a little better at it. Thank you for joining us for Deleted Scenes. Now I'll hand it over to the actual host.
Hello, welcome to Deleted Scenes. This is where Pastor Matt typically, and then I at some point every once in a while, will be sharing some of the things that got cut out of the sermon, because when we're talking about things that we are passionate about, there are often a lot of things that we would like to talk about, but we just can't, because we have a certain amount of time on Sunday, and I'm pretty sure with a lot of sermons that we preach, we could go for at least 2 hours, if not more, and do just a full workshop on what we're studying about. But so that's the purpose of Deleted Scenes, is to kind of talk about those things. And this is kind of Pastor Matt's baby in a sense, because he created this much before I was even here at Turner Christian Church, but he's kind of entrusting me with leading it a little bit now in terms of hosting it, because I'm asking the questions. So thank you for that. But yeah, so as we get into it, I'm gonna ask Pastor Matt questions about what he preached on this past Sunday, and this past sermon was called the 10 Words, and we're going through Exodus, where the 10 Commandments show up, and Pastor Matt led us through this exposition on the 10 words, he calls them. And so I'm going to ask him a few questions about that, and just let him glean some insight that he has learned from his studies on his sermon. So let's start with the first question, unless there's something else that you'd like to start with.
Okay. I'm good. I'm ready.
All right, first question. So if the 10 words were the basis for morals, because you touched on that the 10 words were really a basis for legal and social structure within the people of Israel, but if they were, as the misconception you pointed out, the basis for morality, how do you think that would go over? How do you think that would kind of affect society or affect God's people?
That is a really good question, and I think I'm glad you asked that question, because I think it'll help me explain the difference between this idea of them being a moral code and them being a covenant code.
Mm-hmm.
And because all of the 10 Commandments, as we normally call them, are about moral issues, but they're not the top 10 moral issues. And one of the problems that will come out of that is you assume that these are the top 10 things that bug God or that make God angry, for instance. And so when you look at it depends on how you count it. Different people count the 10 Commandments differently. But the second commandment, by the way most Protestants count it, is you shall have no other graven images for yourself. And in that description it says, because I am a jealous God, and I will basically punish people to the third generation, but I will be kind to people to the thousandth generation. And what that implies then is that God is angry at people who worship other gods, even if they've never heard of Yahweh. So people over in Japan in 2000 BC, God is angry at them for worshiping other gods, even though they've never heard of Yahweh. And that actually has affected a lot of the way the gospel has been preached and the way people have talked about people from other religions and things like that, that God is actively angry at them. But when it says God is a jealous God, that is within the context of this covenant relationship. These are the top 10 rules for being in covenant relationship. So there is absolutely a moral obligation to worship God alone when you're in covenant with him. But it doesn't necessarily make God angry that other people are worshiping other gods who have never heard of him before. That would be like being angry that women I've never met are dating other men. But if I'm not married to them, then there's no expectation that they would, because that's what it is. It's a marriage relationship. And once there's a marriage relationship, there's an expectation. Mm-hmm. So it would be very wrong for me as a married man to date other women other than my wife, but that's within that relationship. Now, that isn't to say that there's no problem with being in other religions, because what the Bible does say about that is they're not effective, they're not real, they're not true, and so they don't help. But the picture that we get of God, if we say these are the top 10 moral obligations, it's saying that God hates people who have never heard of him and worship other gods. God hates people who work on Saturdays or Sundays, depending on when you think the Sabbath is, like those kinds of things. And it gives you, again, a picture of a very judgmental, very type A God who needs to have everything just so in order for him to like you.
Yeah. And I want to remind you, go ahead and feel free to comment questions as they may arise from the conversations we're having or from the sermon on Sunday, questions that you might have. Just throw those in the comments and we'd be happy to answer those. So my second question, and this has come up twice in both sermons that you've preached in this series before, or in this series so far, Best Buy. It's popped up twice. And I kind of hope it continues to pop up. I kind of like this analogy, but we look at the 10 words as documents, right? And there were two copies because in a contract there are two parties that are signing the contracts, and it's why two tablets and everything. It's not because they needed the room, right? You talked about that on Sunday, but it got me wondering. With the 10 words, what type of document that you might have had to sign or popped up in your employment at Best Buy, what kind of document do you think you could parallel with the 10 words or the 10 commandments?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it might have inspired me to continue that metaphor next week, because I think that'll help with when we start talking about the rest of the rules. It's actually pretty easy to make that connection. When I took a job at Best Buy, I signed documents that had specific rules on them. And those weren't the only rules I had to follow when I was at Best Buy. There were other rules, and also I had to follow the day-to-day instructions I was given. But when I got hired, I signed agreements that had at least two things in them. Number one was an exclusivity clause, basically saying if I was going to work at Best Buy, I wasn't also going to work at Circuit City or the electronics department at Walmart or other places in the same industry, because that would create a conflict of interest. I also couldn't work for the companies that sold products in our store. So I couldn't work for Apple and Best Buy. Again, conflict of interest. Anything that would make it so that I wasn't just representing Best Buy in my job, I was not allowed to do. So that's the exclusivity clause, and that's the first 5 commandments, is basically saying you're only going to work this job. The other 5 are part of the behavioral code that I signed on to, that there are certain things you're not going to do as an employee. And that, again, that's not all of the rules I had to follow, but it was the basics of the expectations of behavior for me when I worked at Best Buy. And that's typical for most jobs, that you will have, you're not going to have conflicts of interest. You're only going to work for us when you work for us, and you're going to behave in a way that doesn't embarrass the company. That was another thing I wanted to talk about that I forgot, the comparison I wanted to make. In my family, on my mom's side, we have the 1 commandment, which is don't embarrass the family. And that's kind of what the last 5 commandments are about. Like, I don't want to say embarrass God, but yeah, basically don't embarrass God. Don't make God look bad because you can't be, because you represent him and you're not doing what he wants you to do.
Yeah, exactly. So the 10 words have much to do with Israel's structural outlook in terms of societally and legally. And so with these 10 words specifically, how are they to apply to us in a sense, or are they even? Because it seems as though they're very specifically aimed at Israel and their interactions with the world and with God. So.
So this is a subject that we're going to delve into in the next sermon. We're going to talk about how Christians handle the law in general. But with the 10 Commandments, I think they apply to us, first of all, in the sense that they are still moral principles that we should follow. All of the 10 Commandments are things we should do as God's people. So the point that I was making was not that they have nothing to do with morality, but that they're not the top 10 moral principles. So we should still, when we recognize that the 10 Commandments say don't steal, we shouldn't steal. When they say don't murder, you shouldn't murder. Hopefully you don't need those documents to tell you that, but They still give you that guiding principle of you shouldn't do those things. And the first 5 give you an idea of what it means to follow God. And that's when you become a Christian, you're saying, I am following God, I am obeying God. And those first 5 give you an idea of what that looks like. So they are still commands that should be kept in general. The one that's the Sabbath is a little bit unique because that's not a moral principle. Anyway, the Sabbath gets complicated, and we'll talk more about the Sabbath. We're going to do a whole sermon on the Sabbath, and we'll talk more about it then.
Awesome. So was the goal ever for Israel to be a perfect society? Was that ever the goal?
Was the goal for Israel to be a perfect society? Well, I guess it depends. Part of that is a question of how does God think, because God knows what's actually going to happen. Mm-hmm. Does following the law of Moses make for a perfect society? I think I might answer it that way. If they had followed it, would they have been a perfect society? And the answer would have to be no. Because if they had followed it to the letter, no. Because as we find out in the New Testament, the Torah was not a perfect moral code. Mm-hmm. Jesus, for instance, when he talks about divorce to the Pharisees, he specifically says the only reason why the law of Moses allows for divorce is because Moses knew that you were hard-hearted. And so he gave you the right way to do divorce if you're going to do it. But Jesus says the moral principle is don't end marriages. Yeah. Don't abandon your spouses. There's another nuance in there about the word divorce doesn't mean the same thing legally. Like abandoning your spouse is also within that. But there's also other things. One of the things that we struggle with is in the law of Moses, we'll find things that we find to be morally wrong. Mm-hmm. For instance, in the passage that we're going to do this next Sunday, the punishment for rape is marrying the woman, and we would find that horrible mm-hmm. today. And the point of the law of Moses is not that following this would make you a moral society. The point is that it would make for a culture that reflects Yahweh to the ancient Near East in that time. And again, we'll talk more about that this coming Sunday as we talk about what the Torah does.
All right. Well, I want to turn really quickly to the bulletin that we filled out. And so you have the misconception here. And it says, God chose these 10 words because they summarize the moral that all people owe to Yahweh and each other. All right, so that's the misconception. So that's kind of what Pastor Matt was fighting against in a sense. But why do you think this misconception exists? Why is it there? Why do people feel like these 10 words are the moral obligation that we have?
I think there's a psychological reason and a historical reason. The psychological reason is that we simply want the Bible to be about me. Mm-hmm. I'm looking for the shortest point between the text and me. So this is just a common thing that everybody does. Like, oh, this is about me. Mm-hmm. And so the simple thing to do when you come across God giving laws to people is, oh, these are laws that we're supposed to follow. And so the 10 Commandments, we take that as, I should do these. Also, it's a convenient small set of laws that don't include a bunch of the ceremonial stuff that we know we can't do, like we can't give sacrifices at the temple or the tabernacle, those kind of things. So it's convenient, it's a convenient list of 10. The other reason is the same reason as the misconception last week, which is there's a historical interpretation that says that the purpose of the law is to show you how to get God's approval. And so these are the top 10 ways to get God's approval. And I also talked about this in the sermon that in that perspective, the point of the gospel isn't that God turns out not to approve based on merit, but that through this loophole, he'll get you in on Jesus's merit. But God still is judging you by these top 10. So even when we're forgiven by grace, it's still really important that we do these top 10 so that we stay on God's good side. Because that vision of God means that the gospel doesn't actually change our feeling of God's personality. We begrudgingly get into a dysfunctional relationship with the Father because Jesus gets us in. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that can tend to be the way people feel about their relationship with God. That God begrudgingly accepts them because Jesus got them in, but he's really unhappy with them the whole time. And so in that perspective, if these are the top 10 ways to earn God's approval, then that's always going to be important to God's people to meticulously keep them.
So with these 10 words, why, because you made a point to talk about it, but the 10 words don't include the keystone of Christian morals, which is love. Why is love left out of these 10 words?
In terms of why God did not put love in the top 10 covenant words, I can't speak for him, but it seems to me that so when I worked at Best Buy, the most important things about doing my job were not in those contracts that I signed when I got started. The most important things about doing my job and doing it well was the training I received once I was on the job. And so the top 10, the 10 words, they seem to give the basis for how to stay within the lines of the job. But love is something that is worked out throughout the logic of the rest of the covenant. I mean, the love is in the Torah, and when Jesus roots his command to love in the fact that the Torah commands Israelites to love in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But that's something that you learn on the job, is how I would apply it. It's not something that it's not something that's in the top 10 or in the 10 words, because you need to be doing the 10 words in order to learn from God what love is. That's my theory, at least.
So don't forget that you can comment. I'm not seeing any comments so far. Do you have it pulled up on your computer? Just gotta make sure I'm not missing anything. So next question, how would Israel's structure kind of be judged today? Because I know you talked about how, kind of the purpose of these top 10 words is to kind of guide Israel's structure, so it's not just complete chaos, and that it reflects well on God, right? Because they are to represent God, and this is to reflect well on God. How do you think that Israel's structure, I know there's a lot of years in between now and when Israel existed in the biblical sense, and so that there's a lot of different things that might be questioned now because of the time difference, but how do you think that structure kind of would be viewed today?
Well, the interesting thing about the law of Moses, again, we're going to talk about this in the very next sermon, is that it actually doesn't have a lot of the structure in it. It has, a lot of the structure is assumed. Like the kinds of things that we put in our Constitution, the basic structure of how the government works, not in the law. The law doesn't tell you who's in charge. It doesn't tell you how to make decisions. It doesn't tell you about the legal processes. It just gives you rulings. It gives you these principles. And so all we really have in terms of what it would look like to people today, all we really have is the principles they would be following. And I think we can tell, because it's a big objection people have. People would not think of a society that followed the law of Moses very highly. They wouldn't. I mean, PETA would hate the sacrificial system. That is, that's pretty. Killed a lot of animals. Rules on slavery is tolerated, and women's rights are pretty limited, although significantly more protected than other cultures at the time. So today, societies would not appreciate that very much. But I think it's important to recognize that today's societies are built on the changes that have happened as a result of the Christian Revolution. And so, in a way, when we look back at the law of Moses and we find things that we disapprove of, it's kind of like looking back at the way you acted in junior high and disapproving of that, because that was part of your pathway to where you are now. We know that, just like the example that I gave with Moses and divorce, we know that God was building on an existing society, and so the law of Moses functions within an existing society, and that the primary thing driving us forward morally from that time has been Christianity. So the reason why we think that people should not be treated as property is because Christianity and Judaism, and the Scripture has taught us that people all have value. They're all bearers of the image of God. And the fact that all people, men and women, bear the image of God is the reason why we think that these ancient laws about marriage are so bad. It's because of how far our faith has led us. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we read these rules that seem very antiquated.
So the next question I have is, where in the Old Testament were God's people called into love or called into good morals? Or does it kind of go without saying? Because I know you kind of touched on some of the New Testament scriptures that cover where Christians are called into love. But where in the Old Testament specifically do we see those scriptures if they're not in the first 10 words, in a sense?
Yeah. So I think it's one of the interesting things as you read. We started in Exodus 19 with this reading of what the Torah means, but you can also start moving backward and looking at how this understanding of the Torah changes the way you read Genesis. And what you find is that if the point of Exodus is to reveal God's nature to the world, then you realize that the backstory, going back into Genesis, is the story of how humanity forgot who God is. And then, because you look at Genesis 1 through 11, and it's generation after generation of people forgetting who God is, forgetting right from wrong, forgetting what they're supposed to be doing, and they just move farther and farther away. And so there is an element to which the Torah is helping people to learn right from wrong, but the Torah isn't that moral code. It is the rules for the people who are teaching others about the moral code. Where love will come into it, first and foremost, is Leviticus, I think it's 19, called the Holiness Code. And that's where it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then the second big place where it comes in is Deuteronomy 6, which is where Moses Moses gives this sermon to the people of Israel right before he dies. And before Deuteronomy, the laws are all scattered around in the story. And in Deuteronomy, he puts it all together. And at that point, he starts with, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And he seems to be pointing out, that seems to come out of their failures through Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. So that's where love is really introduced in the law. And then you find that worked out in the Psalms and in the story of Israel and in the Proverbs and Song of Solomon and the rest, and the prophets. They seem to work out what love means using Torah as a guide. They work out what love means, but it ultimately culminates in Jesus.
So we're moving into kind of my final question that I have for Pastor Matt. So now would be the time to throw in any questions that you might have, so we can cover those. But I just want to ask you, is there anything else that you cut from your sermon that you would like to share about?
I cut so much from this sermon because my first couple versions actually had doing each command individually and talking about what each one meant. And I ended up having to take a different approach because my first run through took like an hour. And so a lot of these commands have really interesting things tied into them. And some of this I may be repeating because I did end up working some of it into the sermon and I can't remember at the moment exactly what all made it in. But the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. We take that as a moral imperative that it's wrong to believe in other gods, and God is angry if you even believe that other gods exist. But the grounding for that, the logic for that verse is actually in the verse before that command, because it starts, I am Yahweh your God who saved you out of Egypt. Therefore you shall have no other gods before me. So these are people who have experienced God's salvation. He says, you will worship no other gods. They will have no role in your worship because he uses this logic. He says, I have bought you. I own you now because I bought you out of slavery. We talked in the sermon about what it means, or the fact that the second commandment, if that's how you count it, means you shouldn't make your own graven images. And that has been a huge issue throughout church history. Again, taking that as a moral command, it has meant that there have been wars fought and churches destroyed and people killed over the controversy about how we decorate churches. That because it's taken as a moral imperative that it is wrong to have images involved in worship, which strikes me as very strange because there are so many images involved in worship in the Old Testament. Like not only does the ark have two angels carved on top, which actually looked more like sphinxes, but when they designed the temple, they put two giant statues on either side of the ark. So when you go into the Holy of Holies, it's full of carved images. And when you're in the room behind the Holy of Holies, that's also full of carved images on the walls and in the candelabras. There's so much imagery. So the idea that this is a universal command that it's wrong to use images in worship simply doesn't make sense. What it's really saying is don't make your own images that allow you to control God. And again, you can see that worked out in the role that images play in the story of Israel later on when they run into trouble. And it also explains, the fact that this is covenant law also explains why God never tells Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob to only worship him. He never teaches them, I'm the only God. He says, I'm your God. And why Rachel has these idols with her. There's a story where Jacob's wife, Rachel, has these idols. She stole idols, and it just happens, and it's never talked about again. Even though this is apparently one of the top 10 conditions for earning God's approval, and Rachel breaks it, nothing's said about it again. Because God is in the process of teaching them that he's the only God, and that command really comes into effect when God buys them out of slavery. Bearing the image of God, bearing the name of God. We tend to take that as swearing or as cursing. It's important to remember in the actual command, he says Yahweh. The name of Yahweh, your God. And that commandment is the reason why your Bible doesn't say Yahweh, because Jewish tradition said, okay, we're not supposed to use God's name in vain, so let's not even use it. So they would use the Hebrew word Adonai instead, and our Bibles follow the same thing. But it doesn't say don't use the Lord's name in vain. It says don't bear the Lord's name in vain. And the interesting thing that I've been finding in my studies is that the closest the closest equivalent to that in the rest of the Torah is these places where it refers to the priest bearing the name of he has a breastplate that has the names of the tribes on it, and he has God's name on his forehead, and it refers to him bearing those names into the tabernacle. And so what it seems to be referring to is not you saying God's name in an inappropriate way, although that is still disrespectful. And we would find, I don't know, I'm trying to figure out an analogy, but like we wouldn't use other people's names. You can use other people's names in insulting ways, and we consider that wrong.
Yeah. Well, and just a funny note that I just thought of on this, I was watching How to Train Your Dragon, and they're Vikings, obviously. And at one point, the Viking chief, Stoic, he says, Odin, help us, as in kind of in the form of what a lot of Americans or English speakers might say. I just found that kind of humorous in a sense.
Yeah.
But it kind of goes along with what you're saying. Like we wouldn't think that's like a bad thing to do in a sense because it's Odin and we don't view him as God. And so I just thought that was kind of funny. So
yeah,
as I was watching that movie, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so what it seems to mean, bearing God's name in vain seems to, or in a false way, is what the Hebrew says, seems to mean it's like wearing that Best Buy badge and doing something to badly represent Best Buy. Like I'm bearing that in vain because I'm not actually acting in the way Best Buy wants me to.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing, like when we bear the image of Yahweh, bear the name of Yahweh, we are His representatives, and so for one of the really powerful examples I've seen tied with this is the idea of a crusader who's saying glory to God as he kills Muslims. Or and that religious violence in many different ways, where people will say they're glorifying God, but they're doing something that does not glorify God. That's bearing Yahweh's name in vain, and so it's much more than just cursing or swearing. Mm-hmm. That's the thing. There are places in the New Testament where it says not to use. I forget. Basically, don't use bad language. Don't use corrupting talk. Don't use crude language. That's where you go to say that we shouldn't be cursing and talking like sailors. Not the commandment. It's the same thing with adultery. Like adultery, it's referring to that specific situation because that's what the legal marker of social stability is. But it's also true that sexual relationships are meant to be restricted to marriage because of the way we're designed to bond with other people. Mm-hmm. And you find that in other places in Scripture. That's just not what the commandments are doing. Mm. So those are the big ones that I can remember. Yeah.
Yeah, so doesn't look like we have any comments or questions, so that means you answered your questions well.
Answered all of them, so. Yes. There are no more questions.
There are no more, yeah.
Yes, everyone understands the Ten Commandments perfectly, which means they're doing better than me.
Yeah. So make sure you tune in next week, same time, same place, at least for us. You can take your computers anywhere and be able to tune in, so that's fun. So
and anytime.
Yeah, and anytime really, after 3 p.m. on Monday, because we wouldn't have had done it yet. So, if you could do that before we had done it, I have no answers, but I typically don't. So, anyway.
Wait. Do you think it's harmful when Christians make a big deal about displaying the Ten Commandments in public venues, such as a public school or government offices, where there will be people who are possibly not in a relationship with Jesus? Or do you see it as a good thing? I hope this isn't an inflammatory question. It's not an inflammatory question. It is a good question. I think it's great to have the Ten Commandments where people can see them. I think it's great to have Scripture where people can see them. I imagine there are ways you could do that in a deceptive way or something. But the Ten Commandments, I think that's great for people to see. I do think it's harmful. Personally, I find it harmful when Christians insist on them being in a place like we're entitled to it. And that's sometimes, Christians will be angry that they're being taken down as if we're entitled to have the Ten Commandments in courthouses. That's not in the Bible. There's nothing that says that they're supposed to be there or that we're entitled to have them there. And I think that can be harmful to our witness, especially considering it was Christians who, it was when this country was founded, it was founded and instilled with the ideas that we don't all have to be part of the same religion in order to be an orderly society together. And I think it's a very Christian idea that you don't have to agree with me in order to be treated like a human being and in order for us to get along. That's a very good Christian principle. But when we start to say, no, our Ten Commandments need to be here, we're entitled to have our religious documents in a courthouse, that becomes problematic. Also, personally, I think it's not as much worth fighting for because, again, it's not actually the basis for our legal system the way people argue it is. Our legal system actually is more based on Roman legal systems, and the medieval legal system is where it really built from, because the Ten Commandments aren't a legal system. They're a covenant, they're not a law. So it sends a bit of the wrong signal. Again, it ties back to that idea that if you put that on the wall for everybody to see in a public courthouse, it makes it seem like God is angry at people who don't worship Him if they've never met Him, and like He's insulted by their mistaken prayers to other gods. And that's not what Scripture says. God is not angry at people for worshiping other gods. It's just that there are no other gods, and so they're not following the right path. But God isn't angry at them for being wrong. And putting the Ten Commandments in a public place and insisting on it can send that signal. Thank you for asking that question. It hasn't been in the news as much lately, but I know every once in a while that becomes a big deal.
I'm surprised you didn't ask a question trying to get at me, because my family is always like, we want to put in comments, on these live streams. And
oh, maybe I should have made you answer that.
Maybe you should have. Maybe you should have. Anyway, if there's not any more comments, make sure you tune in next week. Make sure you tune into the sermon on Sunday as well. I'm excited for that. So, is there anything you'd like to say before signing off?
Nope, I'm good.
All right. Would you like to sign off for us?
Sure. Stay healthy, stay hopeful, and go in peace to love and serve the Lord.